You think Darth Vader ruled the Empire? Wrong. The real power sat on their chests, tiny colored bars that could decide who lived, died, and obeyed. Let's decode every Imperial rank right now. But then, before we get to the shiny uniforms and high ranks, we have to start at the very bottom, the enlisted soldiers. The Empire's military machine relied on stormtroopers, pilots, technicians, and deck crews. These were the grunts, the ones who actually fought, repaired ships, or kept everything running. Unlike the Republic's clone troopers, the stormtroopers weren't all genetically engineered. They were mostly conscripts or recruits, trained in academies scattered across the galaxy. Their rank were private/trooper, the lowest level, just a body in armor, corporal and sergeant, mid-level leaders in the field, often commanding squads or platoons, lieutenant, captain, major, higher up in the enlisted chain, usually coordinating whole companies of troops. Most of these guys wore armor or standard gray uniforms, so you wouldn't notice their rank unless you paid attention to the small insignia. But the higher you climbed, the more responsibility and the more fear you carried. Here's where things start getting interesting. If you've ever watched Star Wars and noticed those officers with neat gray uniforms and colored squares on their chests, that's the Imperial Officer Corps. The Empire had two main military branches, which were the Imperial Army, responsible for ground forces like stormtroopers, AT-ATs, and garrisons. The Imperial Navy is responsible for ships, fleets, and space operations. Their rank structure mirrored each other closely, but the Navy got all the glamour. Let's break it down. At the entry level, you had lieutenants. These were fresh academy graduates who might oversee a squadron of stormtroopers or a section of a star destroyer. Above them came captains, not to be confused with ship captains. A captain in the Imperial Army might command a company of troops, while a naval captain could be responsible for a department aboard a capital ship. Then came commanders and majors. These officers filled the gap between captains and the senior brass. Commanders might lead a starfighter wing, while majors oversaw regiments on the ground. Now we climb higher. This is where those colored rectangles start to matter. Imperial rank plaques were deliberately confusing, but here's the breakdown. Colonels, commanders, these officers handled regiments or entire ship sections. They had more authority, but still answered to flag officers. A general commanded entire legions of troops. You'd often see them running large-scale ground battles. Admirals ran star destroyers, battle groups, or even entire fleets, depending on their seniority. And yes, there were levels to admirals. A rear admiral commanded smaller task forces. Vice admiral oversaw large portions of the fleet. Admiral, high-ranking fleet commander. Fleet admiral, extremely rare, often coordinating multiple sectors. These were the men who barked orders at TIE pilots, stormtroopers, and gunners. And they lived in constant fear because, if they failed, Darth Vader usually appeared to remind them that apologies accepted were not a thing. Now, above admirals and generals, the Empire had a set of grand titles that carried terrifying authority. Grand Moff. This was the highest political and military title in the Empire. Grand Moffs, like Wilhuff Tarkin, controlled entire oversectors, basically massive chunks of the galaxy. They were answerable only to the Emperor himself. Grand Moffs weren't just generals, they were governors, rulers, and military commanders rolled into one. Grand Admiral. These were the peak of the Navy. Only 12 existed at a time, personally appointed by the Emperor. They wore distinctive white uniforms instead of gray, and they commanded entire armadas. Grand Admiral Thrawn is the most famous example. Brilliant, ruthless, and loyal to the Empire's vision of control, he was the model of what a Grand Admiral should be. The title of Grand General in the Empire wasn't as common as that of a Grand Admiral, but when it did appear, it carried just as much weight. While Grand Admirals were the masterminds of the Imperial Navy, directing massive fleets and starship operations across the galaxy, Grand Generals were their army counterparts. They oversaw enormous sections of the Imperial ground forces, millions of soldiers, entire legions of stormtroopers, armored divisions, and planetary garrisons. In many ways, these figures had almost unchecked authority within their sphere, meaning if you were a Grand General, you didn't just command a single army, you controlled entire sectors of the galaxy's ground-based military operations. Their rank was designed to cut through layers of bureaucracy, giving them the power to mobilize troops, fortify worlds, or crush rebellions without waiting for approval from lower-ranking officers. This structure mirrors the role of a Grand Moff, who wasn't limited to military strategy alone, but had sweeping political and military control over whole regions of the Empire. A Grand Moff could command fleets, armies, and even superweapons like the Death Star. What made these titles so intimidating was that they blurred the lines between political authority and military command, granting their holders near absolute power over life life and death in their territories. In essence, both Grand Generals and Grand Moffs were the Empire's way of saying, "This person answers directly to the Emperor. Everyone else, step aside." It was a hierarchy built on fear, unquestioned obedience, and the constant reminder that the Emperor wanted loyalty, not debate. One branch people often forget: Imperial intelligence. While the military enforced power with starships and stormtroopers, intelligence controlled it with spies, assassins, and secret police. The ISB, Imperial Security Bureau, had its own ranking officers like Colonel Wolf Yularen, who we see in A New Hope sitting at the Death Star conference table. Within the Empire, the Imperial Security Bureau, ISB, was one of the most feared branches of all. Its officers didn't command massive starships or fleets like admirals did, but their power often reached even higher. What made them so dangerous was their direct line to Emperor Palpatine himself. That meant they didn't need to answer to the Navy or the Army. If they wanted, they could bypass the usual chain of command completely. This authority gave them the ability to investigate, intimidate, and control even high-ranking military leaders. If an admiral made a mistake, lost a battle, or simply showed signs of disloyalty, the ISB had the right to step in. They could open an investigation, strip officers of command, have them arrested, and in extreme cases, even order their execution. The mere presence of an ISB agent on a Star Destroyer was enough to put everyone on edge. This was all part of Palpatine's strategy. He knew that ruling an empire required more than just fleets and firepower. It required fear. By empowering the ISB to monitor and punish even the most powerful admirals and generals, he ensured that no one in the Imperial military ever felt too safe or too secure. Loyalty to the Emperor wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced at every level. One of the most confusing things in Star Wars for casual viewers has always been those little colored squares on the chests of Imperial officers. They look simple, but they actually carry a lot of meaning. These are called rank plaques, and they were basically the Empire's way of showing authority at a glance. But here's the tricky part: they weren't completely standardized. Different branches of the Empire, like the Imperial Navy, the Imperial Army, and the Imperial Security Bureau, ISB, sometimes used slightly different layouts. Still, there were some general rules. Blue squares usually signified the lower level or junior officers, the ones who were still climbing the ladder. When you saw a mix of red and blue squares together, that meant you were looking at a senior officer, someone with real authority over ships, troops, or regions. And then there were the really elaborate plaques with longer rows, often including yellow squares that were reserved for the top brass, the admirals, generals, and commanders who were trusted with entire fleets or major campaigns. So while the plaques weren't always 100% consistent across the Empire, the colors and arrangements gave you a quick visual clue about who was in charge and how much power they held. And those metal rods sticking out of their uniforms? Code cylinders. These acted like futuristic ID keys, giving officers access to restricted areas or systems. The more cylinders you have, the higher your clearance. So if someone was rocking 4 cylinders, you knew they were important. The brilliance of the Imperial rank system wasn't just in military efficiency, it was in control. Palpatine designed the hierarchy so that everyone feared the person above them, and everyone was replaceable. An admiral who lost a battle, replaced instantly. A general who hesitated, choked out by Vader. Even Grand Moffs weren't untouchable, since the Emperor could pit them against each other. This paranoia kept the Empire stable for decades, but it also bred arrogance and backstabbing weaknesses that the rebellion eventually exploited. When the second Death Star was destroyed, the Imperial chain of command collapsed. Without Palpatine or Vader, admirals and generals fought each other for control. Some, like Grand Admiral Thrawn, tried to hold the Empire together. Others, like Gallius Rax, schemed for power. Eventually, the New Republic dismantled the Imperial hierarchy completely, but the First Order would later revive many of the same ranks. Different names, same authoritarian chain of command. So the next time you watch Star Wars and see a gray uniformed officer standing nervously beside Darth Vader, you'll know exactly who they are, what authority they hold, and why they're so terrified. The Imperial rank system wasn't just about order, it was about fear, control, and keeping billions of beings under the Emperor's shadow. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.